Okay, everybody, welcome to today's episode. I am here with Jocelyn Hubbard. I'm super excited. First of all, I have to let you guys know, like behind the scenes, she's a mother of five now, right? Or is it
Five
six?
kids.
Okay,
Five.
five. I didn't know if it was the six. She just had a baby. We both have five kids. So, we're recording this podcast with 10 children between the both of us. And we're good, right? Like, I love getting to interview moms like you, Jocelyn, who like we get on and we're like throwing our hair up in the bun, like we just gotta get this done and everybody be cool. Okay. Um, so I'm really excited to speak with Jocelyn because she teaches teachers, which I used to be a teacher as well, on how to create a culturally responsive classroom. And the other reason that I am so excited to talk to you, Jocelyn, is because I was also a teacher and I take a lot of what I used to do in the classroom and apply it to home. So like, I talk about like decluttering and simplifying spaces, how to do that in your classroom, and now how to do it at home. And you teach, teachers how to do this in their classrooms and you also apply it at home as well. And she does homeschooling and teaches homeschoolers how to do this as well. So I'm really excited to talk to you about how to create a culturally, responsive. I love the way that you say that responsive environment for children and the home, in the classrooms and at home, and to learn from you on how we can actually do this as parents and teachers as well. Because I know there's a lot of teachers in this audience. So thank you for being here. And do you want to tell us just a little bit more about yourself and how you got into what you're doing now?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. And
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me on your podcast today.
Yeah.
My name is Jocelyn, as you said, and I am a mother of five. I just recently gave birth to our fifth child. So there's lots of joy and chaos in our house at all times. But I started my journey. I guess it was from childhood, right? Like I was that kid who knew that she wanted to be a teacher. Like there was never any confusion. My mom said I would bring home extra worksheets and force my younger siblings to be my students. You're going to learn today. So I always knew that I wanted to teach. Now, I'm sure that my teaching methods were not culturally responsive back then, but they have definitely evolved. When I moved from, I used to live in Ohio. So when I moved from Ohio down south, I was kind of hit with a culture shock myself, and I just assumed that because I identify as a Black woman, and I just assumed that because well I'm a person of color and have a diverse background that I should be good to teach all types of students. But the reality is that um, I wasn't. I had students that were Native American and Mexican American. I also had Black students and students that identify as white, and a couple of other races and ethnicities. And I was not prepared. I did not know a lot about some of the history of some of my students as far as their like racial background and ethnic background, and I wanted to be able to make sure that when they came into my classroom, they knew that they mattered, right? Because, for example, so many of my students would say, "Miss, you're the only one that lets us speak Spanish in your class," and I said, "Oh, okay, well, that's your heart language, and I want you to feel comfortable in my classroom." And so I went on this kind of mission to make sure that all of my students felt affirmed, welcomed, and celebrated in my classroom. And it took a lot of work, and it's still taking work. Like I still do research, and I still talk to my students, and I still talk to different parents about experiences that they had in the classroom or experiences that they have just in the world, so that I can tweak and refine the training that I do for teachers, and then also the types of lessons that I bring to my students. So that's kind of where I started.
That's beautiful. I wish that I had known you, and maybe we are doing this at the same time, but I wish I had known you back when I was teaching, because specifically what you said about the culture shock. I went from teaching in Alaska, which, I mean, is its own subculture up there, and just thinking like that's the way that the world is, right? And that's the way that classrooms look.
Mhm.
I mean, I'll just say it like everyone was white up there where I was at, and I moved to Florida and I moved to a school. Yeah, I know you're like, okay, that's different. But it was exactly what you said. It was culture shock because all of a sudden I was the only white teacher.
Mhm,
And I was in classrooms where the majority of the kids' first language was Spanish.
mhm.
And I had to learn, I wish I had known this word back then, culturally responsive, to be able to do that because my worldview was so different from all of the students that I was teaching. And I was teaching, like Montessori, so kids like 3 to 6, and then 6 to 9. But it would have been so helpful to
Mhm.
have somebody like you, like giving me these words and giving me this information of like, this is what's going on, and this is how you can be better at it.
Well, and Krista, I think a lot of times people, like I said, I assumed that because I identified as a Black woman, that I should be able to teach Black students with no issue. And the reality is that we all have a culture, right? Like we all have different backgrounds. I was raised by two parents, a man and a woman, and they came from the East Coast. And so that, kind of tradition and then whatever they grew up with, like all of those things influenced who I was and who I became. I went to college, my parents went to college, so all of those things influence who we are and our worldview, right, our perspective. But our students, they come from a variety of different places and backgrounds, whether they all identify as, as a part of the same racial group or not.
Hmm. Yeah, and the thing about a classroom is that you don't know what you're gonna get, right?
Mhm.
You have no
That's right.
idea.
You do not know.
You're gonna get all kinds of things, and even I think when we talk about diversity, it's really important to remember that diversity is not just your race, right? Like you said, like I had students who had two two moms, right? Two adoptive moms, right?
Yep.
Or adoptive parents, or one parent, right? Or single parents, or a widowed parent, and all of these different things. So I guess my first question for you is, when you say, culturally responsive, what does that actually mean to you? So that, just so that people have like a definition of like what to look out for when they're creating these environments, whether it's in the classroom or at home.
Mhm. So, as far as being culturally responsive, I mean, I think you break that term up and you look at culture and then you look at being responsive, right? So, obviously, culture is a lot of times, well, so a lot of times when we say the word culture, we always think of things that are foreign to us, right? Things that are different. We don't necessarily think about ourselves and our own culture, but culture is, it's the tangible and intangible things that make up who we are. So, for example, some of the tangible things would be like the foods that we eat, the music that we enjoy, the clothes that we wear. And then some of the intangible things are some of our beliefs, right? There are times when you go into an environment and you feel it, right? Because there is an expectation that goes without saying. So I was on Facebook the other day and a mom posted, she was like, how many of you were raised at a time when children were supposed to be seen and not heard, right? And I was like, whoa, that's definitely how I was raised. My sister and I talk about it all the time, that our children are, they are growing up in a time that's so much different. Like they can, make connections and raise their hands and they can have their input. But when we were raised, no, the adults are talking, you leave the room. And that was without being said, right? So that's a part of our culture as well. Um, so you think about that, right, as far as culture, and then being responsive, right? How we respond and the ways in which we respond. Are we being proactive or reactive? And typically in a culturally responsive classroom, you really want to be proactive. So thinking about understanding the culture of all of your students. And it's funny because a lot of times my students will say, because I talk to them about this, I say, look, we're building a culturally responsive class. And they're like, well, how do you know what our culture is, miss? And I say, because I talk to you, I engage in conversation with you, right? And I listen and I ask you certain questions so that I know where you come from. Um, so being culturally responsive, just understanding who your students are, where they come from, giving those surveys at the very beginning of the school year is so important. But it's about how are we using that after the fact? Is it just to be able to file that away, or are we using it, ongoing as we're planning different assignments for our students and thinking, okay, these are the perspectives that my students bring to the classroom. Let's say, just for simplicity's sake, that they all come from a two-parent household. Both of their parents went to college, and they live in like a suburban neighborhood, right? So that's great that they all have this background, but now I need to think about what's missing. What perspectives are they missing? And I need to bring those into the classroom so when they get out of my classroom and they get out of school and they get into the real world, that there's not a culture shock, or like it's not so drastic, right? I mean, I said that I had that culture shock when I moved down south, and it was because, yeah, there's different accents and I couldn't sometimes understand what people were saying because of the accent. Um, just different words that we're using, or the ways in which we're using those words. So really just, like I said, just really getting to know the culture of your students and incorporating that into the way in which you teach them. Because there were times when I could talk a certain way to my students, but they wouldn't understand me.
Mhm.
And communication is more about the receiver than about the sender. And then bringing in perspectives that are missing from the classroom. And then honestly, also really, I should have said this first, but it starts with the teacher too, understanding his or her own culture, and then thinking about that.
That's so good. And that was actually what I was going to ask you is like I think it can be really overwhelming. I know for me specifically as a teacher at the beginning of the year when you have and I used to do Head Start too, so we would actually like sit one on one with the families,
Mm,
and it used to be like pretty overwhelming to have to see all of the all of that the diversity, just to say it's like all of the diversity and like figuring out how to actually balance it. um And I'll just be super honest too that it sometimes was like so overwhelming that it was easier to just not, like just to pretend like, we're just going to teach everybody in this way because
mm,
there's 26 people who I'm trying to connect with. And do you have any like tips for just like simplifying that? And I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then I can kind of share what I figured out doing it in Florida, and
mhm.
kind of what that looked like. But do you have any tips for simplifying that and making it less intimidating?
I do, because I think that is the number one question, right? Whenever I go into school and I get ready to do a training, a lot of times the first question is like, I don't know where to start. Like I have a ton of students, and where do I start? So I think for teachers in particular, not to get overwhelmed, just to start with one piece, right? So like looking at your curriculum, saying, okay, this is what I have to teach, and then saying, okay, now let me pull out maybe my favorite unit. What is the unit that I love to teach? I'll pull that unit out. And then I start with one lesson that's inside of that unit. Okay, now we look at this lesson right here. Now, I want to think about, there are three anchor questions that I always have teachers ask when they're looking at their lessons. The first is, what are your students learning about themselves? So in this lesson, how are they learning about their own cultural perspectives, right? And understanding their own beliefs and giving them those words. Say, look, these are our beliefs and these are your expectations, like so that they know what to call it. So it's not just like this, I don't know, this woo woo thing. So,
Mhm.
what are your students learning about themselves? And then the second question is, what are your students learning about their peers? So now, as they are engaging with their classmates in discussion and conversation, how are they learning about their peers, like the expectations that they have, or their belief systems, and understanding that it's okay to have a different expectation for this assignment. It's okay, or it is okay to have a different perspective about the way that this situation is should be handled. And then the last question is, what are your students learning about the world around them? So those are three ways I think that you can really start, and it's not overwhelming. So it's like, okay, I'm starting with my students. What do they already know? What are they learning? What are they learning about their peers? And what are they learning about the world around them? Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's so good. And like I said, I wish I had had that as a teacher. Because I think I was kind of figuring that out, but I just didn't have the words for it. And that would have been so helpful. So what I learned, being in Florida and all of a sudden having like everything totally different was, like you said, like I think it made it easier to take the pressure off of me to be like, you don't have to like, you don't have to like fix anything, right? You're not like trying to fix anything. You're not trying to like change anything. All you need to do is be aware and like understand how that presents in the classroom. And for me, when I was doing it, it was being mindful of the fact that like half of the families had only been in the United States for like a year or more,
Yes.
or were first generation children,
Hmm.
or just like understanding that and being like all of this content that I'm trying to teach them, like numbers and letters and stuff, like isn't super relevant, right? Like I can't teach them 4 to 5 year old preschool stuff because they can't even understand the language.
Hmm.
I literally can't teach
Right.
them. So it was just that was kind of an extreme thing. But then it was also trying to figure out how to integrate them into this space, right? Because how are they supposed to make friends if they can't even communicate with the other kids in the classroom, right? They don't speak the same, because it wasn't all Spanish. There was some like Creole and French and things like that. But it was it was really interesting to like figure that out, but also like relating to like their family dynamics and even like the things that they brought for lunch. We had a lot of like vegan kids who would bring vegan meals, and like it was just a lot to manage, and it would have been a lot simpler to be like, okay, like you don't have to like change anything. All you have to do is like put yourself in their shoes and be like, what are they going to get from this, right? Like when they're walking into the classroom, what are they seeing and how are they seeing how they fit into that? um
Right.
yeah.
And also, I mean, I think helping them to to learn some of those bigger life lessons, because even if you do get all the way through the curriculum, but have they really learned it? Because they haven't made any points of connection. So, like you said, just especially for students as they are learning English as a second language, or because you were in a classroom that where there were so many different languages being spoken, and different experiences as the students were coming into the United States, and there are different home dynamics, helping them to understand the importance of like perseverance, to understand the importance of continuing to try and to work hard. Like what does that look like to a preschooler? What does that look like to a kindergartner? What does it look like to their parents? And kind of helping to like bridge some of those gaps. I mean, I work as a school teacher predominantly with like upper students, like middle and high schoolers, and so obviously I can just ask them like, what does respect mean to you? What is it? What do you expect to get from this, or what do you expect to get from that? And I get so many different answers, but I'm helping them to see that, look, even if you don't not always get the right answer, quote unquote, that you took the time to think about this situation, that you took the time to really like work through it and come up with an answer. I'm proud of you, and you should be proud of yourself.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And it really can be that simple. I think sometimes we get so caught up, especially in teaching as teachers, and when we have all of this pressure, like perform and get their tests right, which hopefully will change a little bit after this last year.
I hope so. I
um,
do.
yeah, but I mean that was even one thing that I spent a few years in Florida, like working like within the local, whatever they call it, like it's a government basically, the school boards, but I can't remember the name of it. They had a name of it in Florida. But the people who decide like these are the tests that they need to pass. And I'm like, these are
Hmm.
irrelevant. I can't even do the initial assessment with them
Right.
because they can't understand the language, right? Like you need people in here who can actually communicate with them. Like I can't ask them these questions and get an answer
And
because I don't understand.
right. So there's that, but then also there is the cultural barrier of this expectation of what we all know. So when I create questions for my students, I try to give them like this wide range of experiences, even in the questions, right? And we talk through it. So I'm going to use names from different parts of the world, and I'm going to use, if we're talking about going to get food and creating a recipe, it's not just going to be like a traditional recipe for, I don't know, like an apple pie or something like that, right? I'm going to go and say, what's a recipe that might be used in a small town in India, or go, into Colombia, or what I mean. I want to bring that into the classroom, and I tell them, hey, we're going to read this example, and it's coming from this part of the world, because so many times you see those questions, and again, it's like, so when I was working with my students a few years ago, one of the questions was asking them about a child that had like a Walkman, and they were walking down the street, and my students were like, Miss, what is a Walkman? Because that is, that was, even though of course that was my lifetime, right? I had a Walkman and a disc player and all these things, just a couple of generations removed. They don't know what that is. And so I feel like that's a problem that we face so many times with standardized testing as well, is whose definition of standard, whose definition of, oh, this is something that we should all know. If I don't play baseball, you giving me an example about baseball. If I don't play hockey and I don't understand these things, but you're assuming that everyone does. And now the student is stuck because they're like, I don't know how to play hockey. I don't know what the rules are. And then they don't answer the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that same example of like they seem like we don't pay attention to it as adults and like as people who are creating these tests. But there is one in Alaska where there's bush communities of people who live like in the bush where their
Mhm.
food is literally sent to them on planes twice a year. And one of the questions is for the kids is where does pineapple grow? And most of the kids say in a can or on a plane. And of
Yeah,
course they're getting that wrong.
right, right.
But
Because I
wrong to
didn't
who?
know.
Yeah, wrong to who? Wrong to the people who live in places where pineapples can grow or
Mhm.
from the places where it literally comes from a can or a plane, right? Like,
Wow.
yeah, I remember that was like my first year of teaching, and I was like, I feel like there's some like holes here. Like, I don't think this is working. um, so I have one more question, and then we can move into how to actually apply this in your classroom. And if you're listening and you're a mom, how you can apply this into your home too. But how important do you think it is for the teacher to know about their own culture?
100% hands down
Mm-hmm.
the first step. It is so important. And when I train teachers, that is the first thing that we do, is we start with them. We start with their culture and understanding it and thinking about how their culture impacts them as an educator. um, I did a training around Christmas. Well, the training wasn't about Christmas, right, but it was around the Christmas time of year. And so the huge thing that was weighing on me was just how we center Christmas. I mean, I said Christmas, and I'm sure everyone's thinking, oh, yeah, that was in December, right? Because that's what we think of when we get to November and December. We're thinking about traditionally holidays that are traditionally centered around the Christian faith. But when you are talking about a culturally responsive classroom, what about your students that do not celebrate Christmas? And you've got a Christmas tree up and you're doing elf on the shelf and you're giving them rewards for, good behavior or excellent work in the classroom, and it's a little eraser with Santa Claus on it, and like that means nothing to them, right? So like as a teacher thinking about, okay, well, what are my beliefs and what are the things that I traditionally center or I put forward or I elevate, and saying, how does that impact me as an educator? Because then I'm centering those things. And it might be making some of my students feel uncomfortable or isolated. I mean, I had students that were Jehovah's Witness, and so they didn't celebrate any holidays. And so now how am I, minimizing them and the value of their beliefs by making this huge deal out of Christmas, and not, making sure that they're being seen as well. So 100% the
Yeah.
first step.
Yeah. And we are very, and I can even think back to when I was first teaching, we are unintentionally, like you said, dismissive, but
Mhm.
that's still not an excuse to like continue doing it. And I remember too in Florida, um, the first place that I taught, was like the language barrier was the biggest thing. And then I moved to a different part of Florida, and about half or more of the classroom were East Indians. And so Diwali was a big thing.
Mhm.
And it was really interesting. It was the craziest thing because like, oh my gosh, like I've always thought that this was just what everybody did. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, no, like there's other things. And so I'm sharing that with you guys because it's embarrassing for me, right? Because I didn't know, but that's okay, right?
Right.
Like it's okay. Like just acknowledge it and then move on in a different way because I was like, man, like there's a lot of people out here and there's a lot of kids. And I can always think back to like my classrooms in Alaska, which were very monotone, just and like remembering like a few kids of being like, man, like I accidentally made a place that probably didn't feel very inviting to them because
Mhm.
everyone else was doing all this stuff and they weren't.
Right.
Specifically the Jehovah's Witness and specifically like kids who celebrate Hanukkah. And it was
Mhm.
just kind of like overlooked. Or it was a by a, um like a one-off mention of like, oh, and also some people celebrate Hanukkah, not realizing that like that those few kids like that was their thing. It wasn't just bypassing lesson. It was their thing. So now you guys know. That's my embarrassing secret.
No, but you know what? But thank you for sharing that because, like, I mean, all of us have that. Like, it doesn't matter. That's why I say, I thought going in, oh, because I'm this Black woman, that I'm ready for it all, and I wasn't. And I know that I did probably during my first few years of teaching, as I was learning and becoming aware, I probably did make some students feel like they weren't as welcome in the classroom as as I wanted them to actually feel. And it's okay. Like, I believe it's oh boy, I want to say Maya Angelou, but I don't think it was her quote. But it's when you know better, you do better, right? And so when you become aware, then just move forward from there. But like, you can't start moving forward until you acknowledge that, okay, this is something that that maybe I haven't done so great with in the past, but I want to really figure this out and I want to do so much better because I want my students to have the best learning experience possible.
Yeah. And don't beat yourself up over it and don't stay there because then you can't move forward. Just
Not at all. And,
yeah.
because listen, like the other thing too that I like to address right at the beginning is a lot of times people will say, well, I don't, this, this type of training, I feel like it could be uncomfortable because I'm going to say the wrong thing, right? Or people are going to judge me. And I say, well, especially this year, right? As I was pregnant with
Mhm.
my fifth child, and I know you probably understand this. I'm like, hey, Judgment City over here. When I tell people, oh, I'm pregnant with our fifth child, oh my,
Yeah.
well, why would you want to do that? Was it an accident?
You
Like,
know what causes that?
right, like, yeah, right, like you know how that happens, right? Like, people are always going to have their own thoughts and you're going to be judged. I mean, that's the world we live in, but it's not about what other people think about you. As far as like, it's about you being able to acknowledge kind of where you are, and then, like you said, be able to move forward from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, just yeah, don't stay stuck there. Don't stay stuck in the perfectionism or beating yourself up over not getting it perfect because nobody does and that's okay.
No one
Um
does.
so on this note, like we're going to talk about the three things that people can specifically do to create a culturally responsive classroom. Your three P's: picture books, play, and perspective. So, can you share with us how to do this?
Absolutely. So I mean, this is relevant to the classroom, but it's also relevant to the home as well, right? As a mother of five, I try to really incorporate all of these things with my children as well. And I will just say, a lot of times people say, well, but this can't be done with like younger children. My kids are 9, 6, 4, 2, and a month as of
Mhm.
yesterday. So, it can be done. It's about the way in which I approach this, right? So, as far as picture books, whether it's in the classroom or at home, I try to make sure that I have a wide range of picture books with characters that look like my children and characters that do not look like my children. And just making sure that the stories that I'm sharing are not just about the things that are familiar to me as far as with my traditions, right? So like we talked about celebrating holidays a couple of minutes ago. I remember talking with my oldest about, about Christmas, and I said, right, but you know that there are other holidays where that are celebrated around this time as well. And a lot of times those holidays use light as just like we do when we are celebrating Christmas, right? You put the lights on the Christmas tree, or people put lights on their house to decorate, but there are other holidays where they use light as well. So that was a really great way to for him to understand that there are some similarities with some of the different holidays. And well, why do they use light, mom? And why does everyone not celebrate this? And so it really led to some good conversation around that. And so I was able to share picture books with him so that he could see the representation as well. Like, here's a book about Kwanzaa, here is a book about Hanukkah, here's a book about some different holidays. And that can be done in the classroom just as easily as it can be done in the home. And I try to rotate the books that I have with my own personal children. But this is a good practice for teachers as well, especially if you have limited space, right? Like just rotating the books as you're thinking about different seasons of the year, different holidays that are coming up. Putting certain books up as featured books so that your students or your children are able to access those and just browse them at their own time and say, okay, I'm becoming familiar with these concepts. And when you actually read the book with them or to them, then they can really ask much more focused questions because they're more familiar with what they're seeing. Um, and of course, I always have a ton of picture book recommendations all the time. I have some recommendations on my website and I try to rotate those out as well. And on my Instagram, I'm always like talking about different books and like why I like them, how they can be useful in the classroom or in the home. And then as far as play, I mean, that is something that is, I guess people traditionally think about that with younger students, right? Like preschool age, because you do a lot of purposeful play, you've got the dramatic play area, and thinking about what your students are seeing in that area. So like what's in your toy box? Does your child have, and when I say child, I mean your students or your children, do they have dolls that are both male and female dolls? Do they have dolls that are different shades? So they could be Hispanic or black or white um, or Asian, you know, they could be any of these things, but they're different shades and they wear different clothing and accessories that help your child to see that this doll identifies with a particular race, ethnicity, if I can talk, religious background, etc., so that they are becoming exposed to those things, and you can start a conversation with your children as you're playing with them, right? As they're putting the clothes on the doll, and we talk about, well, why does this doll wear this type of clothing, or why does this doll, you know, have this type of hair, and talking through all of those things. I mean, honestly, boy I have boys and girls as far as my own personal children, and all of them have dolls, right? So with my 2-year-old, we bought him a doll for Christmas this year because I was pregnant and we knew we were going to be having another baby, and it was, you know, it was a little girl, so we bought him a little girl doll. And honestly, it was a white doll. And so some people were asking me, well, why'd you get him a little white doll? Like your daughter's not going to, you know, be white. And I said, well, she's not, because my husband is also black, but but this, you know, this is, I want him to see the differences and the beauty. Like I don't know who my son might marry, I don't know who my daughter might marry, or who they might partner up with to grow a family. And I want them to love any shade of child that's in their arms, you know? So again, that goes for being in the classroom or being in your home. Look at your toy box. Is it diverse? Does it represent the beauty of the world around you, and not just racially, like I said, with the clothes that they're wearing, the different hairstyles, um, gender identification? You know, there are a number of companies that create dolls that are doing a fantastic job of making sure that everyone is being represented. And I think that that's phenomenal, because I'm sure, Krista, for you, just like it was for me, that was not the way when we were growing up. It was like, here's
No.
Barbie and that's what she looks like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And all of her friends look the same. And
Yeah.
okay, so when you were talking about this, I just had this like memory pop up that I didn't even know that I had, but I remember I was in like, and it must have been like this really amazing like progressive nurse lady. So I was like
Okay.
in first or second grade. I was sitting in the nurse's office. I think I was sick or something. And she had a little stack of books. And I remember two very clearly. One was a book about a girl who had diabetes, and
Mhm.
one was a book about a girl who was blind. And I
Okay.
remember reading those books and my little childhood, and this I think is the power of books for kids and toys. I remember very specifically being like, who do I know or who has diabetes, right? Like, because I remember in the book, she had these like little snacks that she kept in her pocket, and she was playing volleyball, and she had to stop and take her snack because her blood sugar was dropping. Like I said, I just remember this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in my little kid brain, I was like, I wonder who's in my classroom who has diabetes, right? And then also the book about the girl who was blind and how she read with her hands. And then me being like, I want to go find somebody like this. And I think that's the power of it for kids. Like, especially if like you're not exposed to that. Like if you don't know those people in your real life, I think it opens up the child mind to be like, there are people out here like this and I want to find them. And then it makes it like easier to not make it weird, right? It's just like a normal thing. I just remembered that. But
It's
I mean,
absolutely what
it's
you just
important.
said. It makes it a normal thing, right? So especially when teachers or parents are saying to me, "But Jocelyn, my child is too young to talk about these things," and I say, well, I have a couple perspectives on it, but one of them is that it's about what we normalize for our kids, and when they see it, right, it becomes normal. So, um, thinking about, like you said, just because I don't see this person in my actual like everyday life, I maybe now maybe you do see them but you weren't actually aware of it,
Mm-hmm.
like, and now you become aware of it, and so then you can, think about, okay, what are some ways that I might be able to advocate for a person that that does have diabetes, or that has, other just things that are going on in their life. But when you show kids the books and they see it and it becomes normal, and the types of questions that you ask, right? So just to be 100%, transparent and honest, my niece shared a story of when she got off the bus one day. Some of the students that were on the bus were talking about their parents, and they were saying that for her, and my niece is, she's black, she said that they were saying that for her, that they assumed that her mom was mean because she was black, right? So these were some white students just saying that her mother must be mean. And I was thinking to myself, well, I wonder where they got that. And of course she didn't ask them. She was like 9 or 10 at the time. But just, and so I was thinking to myself, okay, as far as, like you said, normalizing it, just reading a book about a young girl that is doing something with her grandmother and saying, how is this grandma nice, just like your grandmother, and so asking those questions that help them to see without it being this super deep thing, but just normalizing what they see. I mean, that is exactly the point.
Yeah. And like what you said earlier when we were talking about being proactive, kids are going to learn and have things normalized no matter what. And it's a matter of knowing and recognizing that you have a responsibility to normalize things like so that that's not what they normalize, right? Because our mainstream culture at this point of our lives in 2021 is normalizing a lot of things that are not okay. And it it can be as simple as shifting it in your home and like being bold enough to do things like this and have these conversations with these really simple things that you guys are hearing. Like it can be really that simple. Um, Sharing books, sharing toys, like having conversations because kids will pick up on things and we can we can direct it, right? And we can not
Yeah,
make it so that they're not internalizing only that stuff.
kids are very, very perceptive. There's a book, and I can't remember the author, but it's called Something Happened in Our Town. And there's a white girl and a black boy, and they come home and they're talking to their families about what they heard at school and on the bus, right? And they were saying, like, people always assume that because we're kids, we don't know what's going on. And like, but we do, we hear the news too, and we hear like some of the older kids talking, and so it's like kids, they see, they hear, and they want to know in an age appropriate way, like what's going on and how it impacts them or how it impacts their little world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially now with like social media everywhere. Like, and if you have a smart TV, something that we learned this past year was like the smart TV will choose what highlights they put on the TV when you turn on your screen. And we had to like do that because my kids would see like these news highlights and be like, what is that?
Right.
Right. And then we're like, okay, we will talk about this, but thanks, Apple, for like blindsiding us with this. We could have done
Right.
that in a better way.
Yeah, I agree. Right. I'm
um,
gonna have a conversation. I will.
yeah, yeah, we could have done this in a better way. But when you do these other things that you're talking about with the like the books and the play and the like, it makes it easier of like, well, you know how like we talk about this stuff all of the time this is the next level of it, I guess. Or I don't know. It probably just depends on the age of the kids. But for our ages of the kids last year, 14, 11, it was like, okay, this is the next level of conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I mean, honestly, like I said, as a middle school teacher, I used picture books in my classroom, and I still do. Like when because I want a simple way to explain something that's oftentimes more complex or can be a much more challenging concept to grasp. Picture books are perfect for for it being a very simple for like a very simple explanation of what's happening.
Hmm.
And sorry, I know I'm throwing out a couple different examples, but there's a book behind me, and oops, it's called The Case for Loving by Selena Alco. And so this book is about obviously the loving couple and how there was the Supreme Court case so that people could marry people of different races.
Hmm.
And I had my 9-year-old read this because I wanted to start talking to him about about this concept. And but at the same time, this is a book that you could read with middle schoolers or high schoolers because it's very simple. It breaks everything down, and then you start to open up the conversation much more and say, okay, well, what does it look like when you actually go to the Supreme Court? How many justices are there? What is it, just kind of breaking it down in a way. And especially with your children, because they're a little bit older, you can have much more robust conversations, and you're just building on that from the time that they're young all the way up.
Hmm. And don't be afraid to get these books and read them yourself. Like,
Mhm.
like the one that you're talking about with the two kids who go home at the end of the day and have very different, conversations, I'm assuming, is really good for a parent to be like, okay, so these are the conversations. And I've had a lot of conversations like this with friends this past year of like, we're having this kind of a conversation around this event. And what kind of conversations are you having around this event? Because between my friends, depending on their races and on their backgrounds and their family dynamics, like they're having different kinds of conversations than we are having in our home. And I think just being aware of that is really important. And it gives you like an I want to get that book. I didn't get it yet. I just based on what you said, I'm like, I need that book.
Well, and so I just Googled really fast on my phone. So something happened in our town, a child's story about racial injustice. The author is Donald Moses and Marianne Solano, and it's spelled Celano. So that book is really good. And
Okay.
I've read that with again, with my children as well. But um, I agree. I mean, well, and the conversations are different because the experiences are different. I mean, I think the conversations that I have with my son are different than the conversations that some of my cousins are having with their kids who live in New York City. You know what I mean? So they live in a bigger city, or some of my cousins that live in DC. And I was talking with a friend, she's a teacher, and she's like, we're miles away from the capital. And so the conversations that teachers were having to have were so different than
Mhm.
where I live because we're states away, so
Yeah. Yeah. And just like as a parent, like being aware of that, of like the conversation you're having isn't the only conversation that is happening.
hmm
And being
hmm
aware of those other conversations.
yeah.
Um,
So I think I mean, if you're okay with it, I feel like that's a really great segue into the last P, which is perspective. And that's understanding that different people have different views. And that's actually a conversation I just had with my students on Thursday. We were talking about different perspectives around food or something like that. Pretty simple, but um, that even if even if you don't agree with that person's perspective, right? Like, hear them out,
mhm.
listen to what they're saying, which it can be very difficult if you believe that this person is fundamentally wrong, but you don't know what you're going to be talking about if you can't listen to that person's perspective, right? And then start a conversation from there so that you can gain an understanding of why they might have this perspective, or a perspective, from the other side. If someone's sharing their perspective with you and you're like, oh, you know what, I never thought about it that way, right? Like, um here comes another book for you, right? so, so we all pretty much, I think everyone knows the story of the three little pigs, right? There's the three pigs, and they each build their houses, one out of straw, one out of sticks, one out of bricks. The wolf comes and he huffs and he puffs and he blows their house down and destroys the little pigs' lives, except for the third little pig who built his house out of bricks because he was just much more thoughtful and intentional in his house building. So there's that story that is shared traditionally with a lot of younger students. But then there is the true story of the Three Little Pigs, which is the wolf's perspective. And I just reread this with my kids like last week. That's why I'm thinking about it. But in that story, the wolf says when he has a cold. And so that's why he's huffing and puffing, because he's really sneezing. And when he blows the house down, it's like, I mean,
I didn't
good
mean
gracious, the
to.
pig is laying there and the pig's dead. So, I mean, I don't want to put this pig to waste. Like, I might as well go ahead and eat him. So he eats the pig and he says, look, you're judging me, but didn't you just have some ham the other day? Didn't you just have a cheeseburger the other day? Like, perspective, right? So, that is a great set of stories that you can use with children to help them to understand the basic concept of perspective
Mhm.
and how it's important for us to listen to different people's perspectives, even if you don't fully understand it or agree, but that you can start those conversations so that you can understand, and then people can make more informed decisions about if they want to adopt a perspective or not. Um, and just kind of how they want to engage with people that have these different perspectives. But starting in the home and starting in the classroom, like those are some ideal places to have these conversations in the classroom, because you have so many students with different perspectives that it's a great place for students to learn how to constructively converse,
Mhm.
how to disagree in a respectful way, and to be able to share their thinking really thoughtfully and articulately, right? But then in home, it's a great way, it's a great place to have these different conversations with perspective, because these are people that you love. These are people that where you feel, this is your home, you feel safe. And
Mhm.
so you can more easily, typically, right? Not always, but typically you can more freely share your opinion, and you know that you're not going to be maybe judged as quickly, you're not going to be judged as harshly for your opinion, and someone can give you constructive feedback,
Mhm.
and it can help you to grow as a person. So that's
Yeah.
why perspective is so important.
Yeah. And the thing that I've noticed too with my own actively working to understand other people's perspective is that I often feel the need to defend my perspective because I am like perceiving a threat from a different perspective.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
when you can actually like take a moment to like put aside your feelings of uncomfortable and realize that uncomfortable does not mean unsafe, and
Yes.
like examine the other perspective and be like, that's where they're coming from and that's okay and it's of no threat to me,
Hmm.
you're able to see it in a different way and you're able to get a lot of clarity around what you believe, or like you said, be like, okay, so I never thought of that. I have a funny example of my husband and I going rounds about the moon landing. I won't tell
Okay.
you the details, but we I'm like, just tell me. Like, just tell me what exactly it is that you think about this and why. Because you've never said it. Like, you've never let me see this perspective. And then he
Mm-hmm.
did. And I'm like, okay, I never want to have this conversation again because I understand it now. Like, I understand where we are both at and it makes sense. And now we
Right.
can put it to rest. And I don't feel threatened and you don't feel threatened.
Wow. Like just one conversation with
Yeah.
clarity.
Yeah. Yeah. And just, yeah, just putting it aside for a second and realize that you might be uncomfortable with it, but you're still safe. It's not a threat.
Right.
Sometimes it might be. And then you can identify that too. Right.
Mhm. Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it's good for, for both sides and understanding.
Because there might actually be a threat, but then you can actually distinguish between that.
Right. But I think that like that's distinguishing between the two and not just saying, well, if I feel uncomfortable, then it's automatically a threat, right?
Right.
But just saying, how can I think through this?
Right.
I read The Giver with my middle schoolers last semester, and that's a novel by Lois Lowry. And there's a quote in there. The Giver says, there's like a situation where so sorry, let me back up. In The Giver, it's like a utopian dystopian novel, right? So like a utopian society, what is idealistic, what is the best way that we can live our lives, and what, like, community, etc. And so inside of this utopian community, there is a situation where like a plane flies over the city, and um they don't know if they should shoot the plane down, right? But the giver offers them wisdom and says, "I don't think you should shoot the plane down." And they're like, "Well, how do you know?" And he says, "Because when I'm thinking back on the history of, of our people, of all this other stuff, many many decisions have been made out of haste and in fear, and they were often the wrong decision."
Mm,
Right? So if we would just slow down for a second
mm,
and try to distinguish between, am I just afraid of this thing because I don't understand it and I don't know, or am I afraid of it because it really is a legitimate threat?
mhm.
And so that's so good. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so good. Oh my gosh, I love this conversation. Okay, so this was so helpful, Jocelyn. Thank you for just having this conversation with all of us. I know that you have a lot of resources, and your site is designed around that. So, everyone, I'm going to put the resource, like the links to the resources that Jocelyn has inside of the show notes of this. If you're watching on Facebook, it will be in the description of the video. But then you can go check out her site and find all of the great book recommendations that she has. Because also, again, just in the spirit of transparency, if you're like me, you might take a look at your book selection and be like, wow, this needs to be improved. um, and it's just been like an ongoing journey for me. It's better, but she has so many good book recommendations that I don't think I would have ever found, right? Because I think a lot of times we just don't know what to look for.
Right.
Um, so that is there. She also offers consulting for teachers. Are you doing that right now?
I am. A lot
Okay.
of it is virtual, but I
Okay.
am.
Okay. So I know you had the baby. So she does a lot of consulting for teachers. She also is involved in some homeschooling, right? The VH homeschooling program that you can find on her site as well if you are a homeschooler, which I know a lot of you are. Just so many really, really good resources. And thank you for this conversation. Do you want to let us know where the best place to find you is?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. So I guess I'm on Instagram quite a bit. My handle is at I Teach Custom. And then I do have a Facebook group. It's called the Culture Centered Classroom. That is predominantly for teachers, but parents you can jump into
Mhm.
and learn some stuff. And then, of course, as you said, on my website, I have some digital courses and some picture book recommendations and other books. So, and blog
Yay.
posts.
Yes. Oh yeah, and the blogs. I've been going through all of the blogs. So thank you so much, and we will see you all around in the Instagram and all the other spaces.
Thank you.
Yes.